Hello, this is Mike Boucher. Today we're going to do a video on running Sophos in bridge mode. Hope you enjoy the video, and as always, if you haven't subscribed, please do so and check that notifications icon so you'll be notified of new content. Okay, now that we've installed Sophos from our USB drive, it's now time to walk through the rest of the installation and see how we're going to configure the firewall in bridge mode. So before we get started, let's talk a little bit about bridge mode. What the configuration looks like, and really why do I want to use bridge mode, or why should you use bridge mode? So before we get started in the actual configuration, let's talk briefly about what bridge mode is and kind of how it's hooked up and how it's configured a little bit in terms of hardware before we get started and actually configuring the software. So I've got a chart here that kind of gives the idea, the overview of how bridge mode really should work. And I know there's not a lot of information out there, and it is a little bit confusing at first, but I think hopefully once you see how it's configured and how it's set up, it'll make some sense. So the basic premise is that you have an existing router, you have an existing ISP router, possibly, integrated firewall, modem, wireless router that's provided to you by your ISP. Especially if you're running fiber or something like that, or Fios, where it's not easy to replace those type of devices. Sophos will actually configure it, or you can be configured as in bridge mode, which will allow you to keep that existing configuration, put it in front of your existing router modem combo, and allow you to get most of the benefits from the power behind the Sophos firewall. There are some limitations, although they're not that many, such as VPN and a few other things. I'll post a link to those limitations so you can look at them more briefly. But for the most part, all the scanning, filtering, web filtering, that's all available to you whether you're using bridge mode or router mode. It's obviously much more beneficial to use it as a self-contained router, but I know there are many circumstances when you can't do that. So that said, let's get into how to set it up. Now, we're going to cover this two different ways. The first way is going to be setting it up from the installation wizard, which works, but you'll have to know a little bit of information up front. And then we'll go into taking an existing configuration and actually converting it from router mode to bridge mode. So if you've already installed it and you've already been playing with it, it's easy enough to switch over to bridge mode. So with that being said, let's get into it a little bit so we can see on how to do this. Okay, since we've already installed the software, at least in its base configuration, it's time to actually walk through the wizard. So the first thing we're going to do is access the admin screen. So let's do that. And we're prompted with the kind of the setup wizard, the configuration wizard. So we're going to click here to begin. We're going to create a new password because there's no password by default. I'm going to uncheck this here because we'll do that later. I'm going to agree to a license agreement. Click continue. Okay, and here's what we're going to name it. I'm going to call it, and let's pick a time zone. And click continue. And I'm going to skip the registration for now because I've reinstalled this probably half a dozen times. So I'm going to leave I'm going to skip the registration for now. It's warning me there's be some limitations. Click continue on this one. So here's where we make our first choice. This is where we're going to actually change configurations. Under normal conditions, the default would be the router mode. But today we're going to actually do the bridge mode, so we'll switch over to bridge mode. Now, it may or may not pop up with an IP address here in a / configuration. So if it doesn't, what you're going to want to do is edit that configuration. Now, I've got this tied into a kind of a test system, so we can kind of go over the defaults. But here's the things that you need to put in to make sure that they're correct. Now, if you've already got your WAN port, which would be port number 2, already plugged into your existing router, it may pick up an address already. But what I would suggest here at this point is that you switch this to static IP. And once you give it a static IP, what you're going to want to do is give it a physical IP address. Give it a static IP address. You don't want to leave it as DHCP. You don't want it to be picked up automatically, because if it ever changes, you may not know what it is and you have difficulty accessing the configuration or the admin screen, the graphical UI that you're going to need to access. So it's important at this point that you issue a static IP that matches what you have on your existing router. So if you're using a 192.168.1 or .2 or .0, which is what I'm using for my test environment, then you need to make sure that that IP range will work within that, because your output router or the output of the bridge has to be on the same subnet as the input of your ISP or your existing configuration, if that makes sense. So in my case, I'm going to just use some default addresses here, and I'm going to pick the 0.20 as my IP address for my bridge, for my Sophos bridge. The subnet will be /24. The name is not all that relevant. The gateway that I'm using, right now I'm tied into, as I mentioned, an external port. So I'm going to use that gateway. So again, your gateway is going to be potentially different. So you need to know what your gateway is. If you're not sure, check one of your other systems under the network properties, and you'll be able to see what the existing gateway IP address is. So from there, I'm going to also use that for the DNS server. So I've configured now the IP address, which is here for the Sophos bridge. I've given it a / for the subnet. The name again is irrelevant. I've given the IP address and the DNS server the gateway IP of my existing router configuration, being a test or whatever it might be. And that's all I got to do here. So I'm going to hit apply, but now it's updated port 2. So I'm going to click OK. Okay, so now that I've edited my connection, I'm going to switch to bridge mode, and you can see it's picked up my IP address here, and it's automatically disabled DHCP, because again, you don't want DHCP. This is just a bridge, so it's going to pass everything through. DHCP, once you create the rules, will be pulled in from your existing router modem combination. So I'm going to click OK. Again, I want to make sure all these are checked off. You want to click continue. You put in your email addresses for, I've disabled configuration backup for now. I'll do it at a later time. So I'm going to hit continue. Summary of all my configuration changes, and I click finish. Now what's going to happen is a couple different things. It's going to apply, and then it's going to reboot the router, and theoretically we should be in bridge mode. Now there's a couple things that we need to do or need to understand. If the IP address of your current configuration, say a 198.168, is different than the default IP address of the port, in other words, the 172.16, then when this reboots, you may not be able to access the router screen. So we'll take a look at that here in a moment. So while this is booting, I want to show you exactly what I'm talking about here. If I look at the properties, what I've got here is it's thrown out the IP address completely. So it's gone now. It's no longer a 172.16.16.x. It's completely disappeared. So what's going to happen now is, in order for us to access this configuration page, we're going to have to change the properties on our network so that we are able to access the page. So once this is completed reboot, well, I'll show you exactly what that means. So in order to access the web interface now, in order to finish up and actually test this out, we're going to have to temporarily switch to a manual IP address. And I know this is a little bit more complicated than it should be, but because the default address of Sophos is 172.16, when you assign a static IP address to the bridge device and you're assigning it to their existing route configuration, they don't match anymore. So you can't access a 192.168 address from the default configuration, because what's happened is its bridge does. So it no longer has identity, it no longer is issuing DHCP. So the computer that's attached to this doesn't understand it anymore. So what we have to do here is actually give it a physical IP address. So we're going to do that. And we'll go here to IP4 configuration, click on properties, and then we're going to go here and give it a manual address. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it, and I'm give it the default gateway of my test environment, and we'll use the same IP address for the DNS server, and we'll click OK. Close this, and now what's going to happen is you can see here that the network icon is now OK, and if I go ahead and pull up the admin screen from the default address, I'm now able to access the web UI. So let's click move on. Okay, so again, what I'm pulling up here is I'm pulling up the UI of my Sophos bridge. And remember that right now, this is the way, in its existing configuration, it does not issue DHCP addresses. As a matter of fact, it will probably block DHCP addresses from being issued to any device that's pulled into it. So before we get a whole lot further, I want to review one more time how we have this configured. Just a reminder, so what we have here is our existing router, ISP router modem combination. We have the Sophos bridge, which again we've given a 192.168.0.20 IP address, and it's a standalone device. It does not serve DHCP as it stands right now. And to attach multiple devices, obviously we'll need some kind of a switch or multiple switches. So all of your normal network stuff will be outside the bridge, and then everything will pass through the bridge into your existing configuration and out to the internet. So all the filtering, scanning, etc., and protection will be done here through the Sophos bridge. So I hope that makes sense. But again, the important thing to remember is that this IP address and anything you attach to it right now have to be on the same subnet in order to get to the configuration screen. And you have to get to the configuration screen by the IP address that you set, not the default 172 address. So I know it's a little confusing, but hopefully this makes sense so far. So the next thing we've got to do now is let's go ahead and log into the admin screen and see what's kind of going on. Okay, again, it's going to ask me to, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say I don't want to register right now, click OK. Same thing we did before, continue, and we're now into the configuration screen. And just to confirm, let's make sure we've got internet access. So I'm going to go ahead and access my website, and there it is. So everything is working correctly for this system. We got green zones all the way across, and we're now, let's go take a look at the firewall rules. These are sample rules that are disabled right now, so if you look at any of these, they'll be disabled. This just is created by default on a fresh install. The only ones that are really active are these two, and the default one that's actually controlling everything is this one. So this one is where we're going to actually later on change the intrusion protection or prevention, and then add some web policies as well as application controls, which I've created entirely separate videos on how to do. So we're not going to get into actually configuring the application control and default web policies. I'll post a link to my existing video on detailed configuration for that. So the important thing here to note is that everything now is ready to go. It's working, but only on this computer because I've manually attached an IP address. Now, if you're going to put static IPs everywhere, then you'll be good to go and you're on your way. But that's not practical. what makes more sense is to actually allow DHCP to be served by your current router. So I want to clarify that by default, Sophos, since it's filtering all the traffic, it's going to block DHCP from being issued from your existing router ISP. So if you attach something else to your switch, it's not going to get an IP address by default. What we need to do is create a rule that allows the your existing router/router modem combo to actually issue a DHCP and actually be allowed to pass through into the device. So we need to allow Sophos to be okay with issuing DHCP. All right, so let's go ahead and address our DHCP problem so we can allow devices that you plug into your switch or to your network to actually acquire a DHCP address. Now, this is actually a three-step process. The reason it's a three-phase process is because, number one, we're going to name the Sophos device. We're going to give it a name so it can be referenced in the rule. And secondly, if you've worked with Sophos before, you know that it doesn't create bidirectional rules. So you have to create a rule for going out and going in, depending on what the situation is. Most of the time, it's just an outbound rule. But in this case, it's going to be one that allows bidirectional traffic. So let's go ahead and first name our device. So we're going to do that by going to Host and Services, and we're going to add a new host. And let's call it DHCP server. It's going to be a IPv4, and the IP address we're going to use is the DHCP server of your existing configuration, whether it be an ISP router or your own router modem combination. So in this case, in this test environment that I have, it's 192.168.0.1. So that basically says that the DHCP server for this network is 192.168.0.1. And we're going to hit save. So now we've added the device. So now let's go ahead and create the two rules we're going to need to allow acquisition of a DHCP address. So we'll go up to Firewall, and we're going to click Add User Network Rule. And we're going to turn off the automatic rule grouping, so we don't want anything like that right now. And the first thing we're going to do is name it. So we're going to call it DHCP outbound. And the position we're going to use is top. And the source zone is going to be our LAN. So let's pick LAN. The source network, any. Schedule time, all the time. Our destination will be WAN. And destination networks will be any. And then on services, we're going to actually use DHCP. So we'll uncheck any. We're going to restrict it to DHCP. And click apply. Down here, we're not going to enable any filtering, web filtering, anything like that. The only thing we're going to do, actually we're not going to do anything else here, so this is going to stay exactly the way it is. And remember not to log traffic on this. The reason is because pretty much everything's going to go through these rules, so you don't necessarily want to log traffic on these two particular rules. So we're going to go ahead and hit save. Okay, so we're going to do one more rule. And this one we're going to call DHCP inbound. And again, this is going to go at the top. We don't need any grouping. And this one's going to basically reverse. So we're going to hit WAN. be any source network or end devices we'll leave alone. It's going to be on all the time. Our destination is going to be LAN. Let's apply that. And this will also be DHCP. So we'll uncheck this and we'll check DHCP. Now I did make one mistake, and that's up here under source networks and devices. This is where we're going to actually call out the DHCP server that we just named earlier. So we'll do that, and there's our new DHCP server that we called earlier, and let's click apply. So in this rule, we basically saying that from a WAN source, which is actually the output side of our device, that it's allowing communication from the DHCP server back into the LAN for DHCP services only. So basically it's allowing traffic back in. And again, we're not going to put any filtering or anything like that. And everything else pretty much stays the way it is. And again, don't want to log traffic on this. It's not necessary. And let's go ahead and save this rule. So we now have two rules, one for inbound, one for outbound. So basically anything that we plug into our network that requests the DHCP will be allowed to pass to the DHCP server, and anything when the DHCP server responds, it'll be allowed to come back into the device on the LAN, but only for DHCP services. So now we need to verify that this actually works. So if you recall, let's go ahead and double check our network properties. So as we did earlier, we actually set a static IP on this particular system in order for us to be able to access the device. So now what we're going to do is actually switch to automatic and obtain a DHCP address automatically, as well as the DNS server, and click OK. And now what we should see down here, is now that it's actually re-identified and it's now able to communicate, and we can verify that by going to somewhere. Let's go to GoDaddy or someplace, or we'll go to my website. The point is, as you can see, it's actually communicating. So if we re-verify the properties, we now will see a different IP address. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. We now see it's been issued a .241 address versus the .19 that I had before. Just basically proving that anything I plug into this is actually going to communicate. So let's kind of do a little bit of a recap here, because I know there's a lot of steps in this and it's a little bit on the confusing side. So let's just do a quick recap, because there's a couple of important things that you're going to want to remember. The first one is obviously make sure you create those DHCP rules. Without those, anything you plug in will not be able to communicate unless they have a static IP, and that's very impractical. Certainly, I recommend using static IPs on devices that you don't want to change, like NAS units and stuff. But overall, anything you want to plug in, you want to be able to issue a DHCP. So make sure you create those rules. The other thing is just to understand a couple of basic things about how the Sophos bridge is actually working. So starting from down here where the switch is, so we basically have all of your devices on the network are going into some form of switch, whether it's multiple switches or whatever. And that includes any access points, wireless access points. Everything has to come in through the switch. From the switch, it's going to pass the traffic into the bridge. Now it's passing it into the LAN side of the bridge, and it's going to process it, filter it, do what it needs to do, and then output it on the WAN side of the bridge, which is really, since those two interfaces are bridged together, it's invisible. So it's basically a pass-through. But the one thing that you have to remember is that these devices have to be on the same subnet in order for it to communicate properly. There are other ways that can be done, but for all practical purposes, you're going to want to have your Sophos bridge be able to be on the same subnet as your existing router configuration, whether that's a 192.168 or a 10 dot, whatever you're using. Your Sophos bridge for the IP it has to be the same subnet. So you don't want to be trying to put the bridge on one subnet and your existing network configurations on a different one. It's not going to go through. So that's really important that you understand how this fits into the equation. You're basically breaking the connection between your existing configuration and the output of your switch and inserting the Sophos bridge. Again, I'll post a link to some limitations, but for the most part, the primary thing that you'll lose is access to the Sophos VPN. It'll pass through the signal, but it will not actually allow you to use the VPN functionality that's in Sophos, which is something I use all the time, but it's again, it depends on, everybody has their own situation. If you're doing that, you'll either have to use the OpenVPN on your NAS or create your own VPN, or maybe there's one in the existing router modem combo that you already have. So, and again, there's a few other things. I'll let you take a look at it and decide for yourself how important those limitations are. But all the filtering, scanning, IPS, all that's going to work just fine. And then you can experiment with creating rules and filters to help protect your network. So it's not a bad way to go. It's obviously an extra step, and it would be more efficient for you to just actually use it as a router gateway. But if you can't do that for reasons, then this is the next best thing. Rather than trying to use something that's basically inferior from your ISP, this provides you a good level of security to put in between. So I hope that cleared up the issues. I know that I've been reading some of the forum posts and stuff, and I know there's a lot of people that are confused about how this works, and I can understand why. Because there's no documentation anywhere, and there's really doesn't, even explanations from Sophos directly do not properly explain the entire process. They explain how to set up rules, they explain, certain aspects of it, but they don't really explain the total interaction between IPs, the subnets, your devices. They don't even really put the requirement for DHCP in there. It's a completely separate set of instructions. So hopefully this helps to clarify some of the confusion. Now that we've got the bridge configured using the wizard and we've got everything working, I went ahead and reinstalled it to a new installation. As you can see, this is a fresh and clean installation. I want to walk you through how to configure an existing installation. So if you've already got it installed and you don't want to reinstall, there is a way to actually set up the bridge from within the GUI, but there's a couple caveats. So let's walk through it and you can kind of see how the process works. So just to verify, this is a new installation. It's set up as this traditional way as a router. So as you can see from my properties, it's set up as a DHCP server, gateway, traditional router configuration. It's issued a 172.16.16 IP address. And as you can see from the top, I'm actually accessing it from the default 172.16.16.16 IP address to access the configuration. So it's in a really traditional gateway router configuration. So now our task is, how do I get it into the bridge mode and what do I need to do? So the very first thing you need to do is we need to actually create the bridge, and that sounds more complicated than it really is. So let's give that a shot. Let's go over to network, and if we look at our interface cards, you'll see that we have port 1 as the default LAN port, and port 2 is our default WAN port. So let's now configure these so that they are in what's called a bridge configuration. So what we're going to do is we're going to add an interface, and we're going to add a bridge. We're going to give it a name. And once we've given a name, we're going to actually go down here to the interface, and we're going to say, okay, I want to bridge port 1, which if you recall is our standard LAN port, and port 2, which is our WAN port. So we're bridging these two interfaces together. So whatever comes in one kind of goes out the other, exactly as we did when we set the configuration up from scratch. Now, there's a couple other things we got to do here. We have to select one of these configurations, either an IP4 or IPv4 or an IPv6. So I'm going to pick IPv4, and this is much like we did when we set up the device from scratch. We have to give it an IP address. So I'm going to pick the same one you recall from my last example. And again, I'm going to give the gateway name, not that important. You can call it whatever you want. And the IP address, again, we're going to be giving the IP address to your existing router's configuration. In my case, it's my test environment. So I'm going to say 192.168.0.1. So I'm referring it, basically, I'm bridging these two, and I'm saying, okay, pass the traffic through both of these devices, or combine these two devices and use this gateway. So I'm going to hit save. There's really not much under advanced settings that I need to be concerned about at this point. And if you notice here, I did not enable routing on this bridge pair. That's a whole different topic, so we're going to skip that for now. And I'm going to click save. And it's telling me that if I add the bridge, it's going to interrupt my configuration. And I'm going to say, okay, add the bridge. Now you're going to notice that this thing just spins around forever. This is some of the things they don't actually tell you about. And it's obviously prompted me with an error message. Now, one of the challenges, or one of the things that actually happens here, is if I look at my properties here, I still have a 172 address. However, I don't have any connection to 172 anymore, because it has taken the configuration, it has saved my settings, but I can no longer access the bridge because the bridge has been given a new IP address. So if I need to access that bridge, I need to actually access it with the new IP address. But before I can actually access it with the new IP address, I have to be on the same subnet. So what I need to do, and this is an important part that's sort of left out, is I need to go and change back to manual IP for now. So let's go to properties, let's go to IPv4, and let's give it an address. I'm going to use the gateway, and again I'm going to use the same gateway for the DNS, or the same IP for the DNS. Okay, and I'm going to click OK. And you notice that my network icon got well again. And now if I go and try to load the configuration with the new IP address, it works fine. And there it is. So now I'm going to go in. Again, I'm not going to register for now. Okay, so there I am. I am now accessing the web UI using the new IP that I gave it. If I look at my network, I no longer have ports 1 and 2. They've now been bridged into this new bridge called XG bridge that I made up. And there's my default IP address and configuration. So now the next question is I've got to be able to get traffic through this thing. So I need to be able to, and also need to take care of my DHCP problems. Let's first verify that I've got traffic. So I've got traffic. It's coming up and it's allowing me to access the internet. But again, as we discussed in the first part of this video, this only is working for this particular system because I've assigned a manual IP. So again, I need to recreate those 2 DHCP rules. So I'm not going to have you sit through that again. You'll need to refer back to the first part of the video, but I'm going to go ahead and create those rules real quick and then we'll verify that it's working. So real quick, I've recreated the DHCP server. You can't forget that step. Okay, so now I've recreated the 2 rules that we did before. And again, don't forget to name your DHCP server. So I've got my 2 rules created, the inbound and outbound. And now we're ready to test to make sure it works. Again, all we've really done is bridge 2 interfaces together. We created 2 rules for inbound, outbound. So now let's go back to our network properties and let's re-enable auto. Click OK. So the network drops momentarily and then comes right back. So now what we should see is, first of all, let's verify that we've got traffic. And we do. Let's go back, double check one more thing. Okay, so everything's working. So now the question is, did it give it a DHCP address? So let's go and verify that. Let's look at the details, and there it is. It's given me that DHCP address again. So relatively painless to do it from an existing configuration. One couple things you need to be aware of is that when you bridge a LAN and a WAN interface together, you will most likely wipe out all the rules that you've created. So if you've got a bunch of firewall rules that you created, they will most likely disappear. So you need to be aware of that when you are doing this type of bridge, that the rules may no longer apply. So keep that in mind when you're creating a bridge from an existing configuration. Hopefully you haven't spent a lot of time on things that you don't want to lose, because it's basically a restart. In my opinion, this is actually more straightforward and easier rather than doing from scratch. Of course, if you're doing a fresh install or a new install on a device, you're obviously going to configure it right out of the gate. So I hope that makes sense. So that's pretty much all there is to creating a bridge, both from scratch and to an existing configuration. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and Happy New Year to everyone. And thanks again for taking the time to watch the video. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe and click that notifications icon so you'll be notified if the next video comes out. And I'll see you on the next one.